Today we're reviewing the AMD RX 6900 XT sort of flagship card. The 6800 XT and the 3080 are more the proper gaming flagships. And then you've got the halo effects products, the 6900 XT and the 3090 from NVIDIA. So we're reviewing the 6900 XT. It comes in about $500 under the 3090. There's some key differences, but AMD, thus far at least, seems to be targeting its 6900 XT more fully towards gaming. And that's what we'll be looking at today alongside power, overclocking, very interesting behaviors there, especially with undervolting, and some thermal and fan performance. Before that, this video is brought to you by Arctic Cooling and its Liquid Freezer 2 line. Arctic is actively restocking its Liquid Freezer 2 coolers that rank among the top performers for CPU coolers right now, including on Ryzen CPUs. The Liquid Freezer 2 series is focused on high thermal performance and value, featuring a blackout design and including a VRM fan mounted on top of the pump block to help provide airflow over neighboring VRM heatsinks. Arctic has also started selling its P12 120 case fans. Learn more at the links in the description below. So getting into this one then, the architecture hasn't changed from the 6800 XT. All the behaviors are pretty much the same as we've plotted in those reviews. So that stuff still all applies. The fan behaviors apply because it's actually the same cooler too, except for PCB changes on the VRM side. And then the thermal response changes for frequency apply as well. So our overclocking stream with the 6800 XT is where we show some of that thermal frequency response. That applies to 6900 XT. The card also has the same memory. It's at 16 gigabytes of memory on the 6900 XT. The key difference between the 3090 and the 6900 is that memory capacity. So the 3090 is still a 24 gigabyte frame buffer. We have all seen rumors at this point of refreshes for the 3080, but they haven't materialized yet. So for now, the 3090 is the only card that sits above AMD's cards for memory capacity in the current gaming like GeForce lineup from NVIDIA. That 24 gigabytes, it's enough to be a consideration for maybe 3D artists, people who don't need the Quadro level validation and assurances or the Titan level features, but could still use the memory. So 3D art, for example, Andrew Coleman on our team can make use of it in Blender and sculpting applications like that. But otherwise, AMD has been advertising the 6900 XT as roughly at parity or plus or minus a little bit from the 3090 in rasterization performance, not speaking of ray tracing there. And at $500 cheaper, that's a significant thing to claim. So we'll be looking at those numbers. The AMD performance thus far as a recap for the 6800 and XT versions of the card has an interesting behavior where at 1080p and 1440p, but especially 1080, you start to see the scale shift where if NVIDIA has a slight or even sometimes up to 15-20% lead in some instances at 4K, as you approach 1080, AMD will start taking the lead. So we'll be looking at that again today as well. And obviously this gets into territory where you as a user have to be aware of your own use cases and what you want in order to extract the most valuable information from reviews. As always, you should watch multiple reviews to put the whole thing together because these things are getting extremely complex. And the test matrices are ballooning to a point where it's impossible for anyone to test absolutely everything. And that gets especially true with ray tracing, which we're testing today as well, where you now have considerations of DLSS on or off, so you're running everything twice for that, and even the game selection is becoming challenging too. So we're gonna get into the review today. This is a video card that will supposedly exist at some point. We don't know what the stock's gonna be, presumably not great because it's a high-end card, so yields are going to be more restricted for these and pushed down to the lower tiers, and this might be something that you can leverage later rather than immediately for your buying decisions. As a quick reminder, the news video we recently published, again, I don't really particularly want to share the information, but I will be in for a minor surgery, not a big deal, on the day this review goes up. Only reason I'm mentioning that is because review publishing is always pretty high stress because there's follow-ups where people start discovering things and they want reviewers to follow up on those. So we will not be able to do that this particular week. If there's some interesting story that emerges from the 6900 XT, I would encourage you to check out any of the high number of other good reviewers out there for their follow-ups because we're going to be unable to do so for the 6900 XT this particular week. All right, enough of that. Let's get into the review, starting with the frequency numbers. We'll start with frequency validation to ensure that the card is working as expected, but also to learn how it compares to the AMD RX 6800 XT previously. This plot is zoomed into a vertical axis range of just 250 megahertz from 2250 to 2500 megahertz, and that's in order to better see the data. That said, it does make the gaps look much wider than they sometimes are. This is by design for legibility, but just remember that a proper zero scale would show how closely some of the entries are. That stated, starting again with the 6800 XT card from previously, the plot ping-ponged around somewhere between 2330 and 2360 MHz with an initial spike at the outset that was not sustainable as the power load and thermals ramped. The cards, as always, will run into power and thermal constraints for frequency boosting before anything else. Plotting the RX 6800, that one held closer to 2275 to 2290 MHz, running lower than the 6800 XT when both were stock. The 6900 XT, our new one, peaked at 2375 MHz to start, then fell to about 2289 to 2310 MHz once steady state thermals were achieved. That puts the 6900 XT stock card as technically below the 6800 XT and above the 6800 stock card for frequency. On average, it was about 50 MHz below the 68 XT, but it fluctuated, and the additional CUs will make up for this loss. The next chart will show fan curve responding to the temperature ramp. This can sometimes be helpful for identifying fan curves that are too initially aggressive or too anemic, as was the case for some of NVIDIA's launches this year with its FE coolers. It's also useful just for understanding the VBIOS temperature targets, the temperature that the card tries to maintain when left to auto. The 6800 XT, as a reminder, held about 1600 RPM under auto conditions in our test environment, which kept the GPU edge temperature to about 75 degrees Celsius and the junction temperature in a range of 93 to 95. Plotting the new 6900 XT, the auto fan curve planted the fans lower at just 1300 RPM. The GPU temperatures, meanwhile, plotted at 80 degrees Celsius for edge and about 93 to 95 for junction. We already know that AMD's VBIOS behaviors, including core frequency and fan RPM, follow junction rather than edge. As this is the case, it seems that the delta between junction and edge on this particular cooler mount, using the same cooler as the 6800 XT, just maybe mounted better, is better than on our 6800 XT. It's reduced. The gap is smaller here. Further helpful is the fact that the 6900 XT is a better bin than the 6800 XT, words from AMD itself, and so is capable of running at lower voltages for a given frequency than the 6800 XT. These two factors combined allow a lower junction temperature, thus allowing the fans to spin slower in order to maintain the temperature target. If we were to manually adjust the fan to equal the 6800 XT reference card's auto speeds, the 6900 XT would run more efficiently overall. Again, that's part quality of the mount and part bin. Noise levels haven't changed from the 6800 XT cooler, so we can show the same chart. The 6900 XT ended up in the range of about 36.1 dBA when allowed to run under auto VBIOS conditions and tested with our standardized methodology. That's with a 20-inch distance from the cooler. The 6800 XT was closer to 40 dBA stock under these auto conditions, for gaming workloads at least, and the reason for the difference is described in the previous chart. Maximum noise level is about 57 dBA, but this shouldn't be encountered unless there's something wrong with the mount, like if you reassembled it improperly or if you manually set the max speed as another reason. So overclocking works in AMD software by setting a clock range that allows a minimum min to max delta of 100 MHz. That's the closest you can get the two together. AMD limits the GPU frequency and its setting to 3000 MHz in software for the 6900 XT, though you shouldn't expect to hit that, and it limits the memory frequency to 2150 MHz in software. Unfortunately, this is a huge limitation for extreme overclocking, so it does limit what we can do on LN2, but for air overclocking, the memory limitation is the biggest one for you on this card. The problem is that changing the frequency only nets a reduction in performance on the 6900 XT in our experience. But it's in a way which will cause a lot of users, based on past experience browsing forums, to think that they have a stable, high clock of something insane, like 3000 MHz, when it's actually running way lower. So just a PSA to be careful to validate your clocks when you think you've set them higher. The range here will apply and the drivers won't crash, but the performance can silently tank in the background. In this overclock stepping chart, you can see that our initial stock performance had us in the range of 2220 to 2280 MHz. The temperature numbers are useful only for comparing the frequency, but shouldn't really be read into beyond that because it's all spot checking here. So the power increase of 15% in one of the earlier rows bumped us to 2326 to 2398 MHz. And as we run through the numbers, you can see in rows 31 to 36, we tried everything up to 2620 to 2720 MHz for the range, but we were seeing either the same clocks or reduced clocks sometimes. In the far right, you can see our Port Royal score, not run for everything, but for a good amount of them. And we used Port Royal because it's highly consistent, where you'll often get the same exact score run to run if you change nothing, or plus or minus just a couple of points. So very useful for this. The 2590 to 2690 range was perfectly stable and looked fine, but plotted at 8702 points to the stock runs at 9627. That's a major regression, and is again proof of why you should be validating the overclocks with performance to make sure it's not getting worse silently. We slowly dialed in an optimal range of 2450 to 2550 megahertz for core, which got us to 10246 points. This held consistently and plotted an improvement in every test pass, whereas other settings, like 2480 to 2580 or 2500 to 2600, would occasionally bug out and regress, but they would also occasionally plot high. For memory, 2150 was fine, and that's the max setting AMD allows. Ultimately, these frequency range numbers don't really seem to mean anything because it just ignores them as soon as it becomes unstable, which is bad. It should crash instead, because if it's ignoring them, then you don't really know what's going on anymore as a user, and you're not really sure that anything's working. Or you leave it thinking that it worked, and you don't actually have a stable OC. The end uplift was 8.3% versus stock, but the important thing here is that we had to reduce the voltage on this particular card to get any uplift. In fact, if you look at some of the scoring, where, I'm not sure if we plotted it in this chart, but where we basically restored to stock, except we reduced the voltage, then we started seeing uplift. So 1175 is the default, but we brought it all the way down to like 1050, 1080, 1020, all in that range, millivolts, and we were seeing uplifts for most of those until we hit instability in like the 1030, 1020 range. We're gonna keep the SAM numbers really short since we already explained it in the 6800 XT review. This is just for a couple of A/B comparisons as a reminder. We don't have the 3090 in here right now, but at $500 more, it's not really a direct comparison anyway, and it'll be in the next dozen or more charts. In Tomb Raider at 4K, enabling SAM saw almost no difference on the 6900 XT. It went from 97 to 101 FPS average, so that's enough to create a few more percentage points of space against the 3080, but that's about it. At 1080p, the 6900 XT with SAM off equals the 6800 XT with SAM on, but we're also up against a CPU limit here, which constrains the chart. The FPS on versus off difference is still just a couple of points, so no big deal. Hitman 2 had the biggest impact from SAM previously, so we'll show that as a contrast to the near zero results in Tomb Raider. In this one, the 4K Ultra result had the 6800 XT previously scaling from 100 FPS average to 111. The 6900 XT with SAM on moves to 119, so that gives it an average of 18% lead over the RTX 3080 in this very specific test. Three Kingdoms showed no difference. SAM on versus off had at about 46 FPS average either way. Still below the 3080 with SAM off when at 4K, and still with the same frame time consistency advantage over the 3080 that you'll see in the later charts. So that's enough of these. We have the rest of the SAM data in the 6800 XT review, and you can check that out for more scaling information. Let's move into rasterized game performance on our standard test bench. This will be one of our last few reviews on new silicon where we'll be using this bench. We'll probably be moving to Zen 3 or to Rocket Lake in early 2021, depending on which one does better for a GPU test platform. Might be a while longer for Rocket Lake though. Either way, for now we're sticking with what we have to finish up the year. Starting with Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K, the RX 6900 XT stock GPU ran at 98 FPS average, with lows paced behind as expected. This puts it about 5% ahead of the 6800 XT stock card, with the 6800 XT OC mostly leveling them. The lows are spaced proportionately on each card and not significantly different, or at least not noticeably so. The 6900 XT OC improves to 102 FPS average, with an overclock that is, and with an undervolt, and that's a 4% bump in average frame rate. As for the RTX 3090, that runs 104 FPS average. We didn't have FEOC data, and our card is currently disassembled, but a more expensive partner model, noting again that it is more expensive, gained 6.5% over the 3090 FE when using the original lower power limit V BIOS on the FTW3, not the newer one. So then the FE 3090 leads the reference 6900 XT, both stock, fittingly by 6.9% here. We'll need to remember this number as we get into the lower resolutions for testing the scaling. As for the rest, well, it's the same story as the 3090 was to the 3080. The 6900 XT thus far appears difficult to justify over AMD's own lower tier SKU, just like the 3090 was to the 3080. It's a Halo product in the truest sense of the word. At 1440p, the RX 6900 XT stock card pulled 172 FPS average, approaching the CPU ceiling of about 180, 185 for this game. The 6900 XT has a 4.7% lead over the 6800 XT stock card and is functionally tied with the 6800 XT OC. The RTX 3090 Fe is roughly tied or slightly led by the RX 6900 XT, which is 1.5% ahead in average FPS. Overclocking both of them puts the 6900 XT at 175 FPS average, a bump of 1.8% over its original score, and the 3090 FTW3 to 176. They're about the same, either stock or overclocked at 1440p. There's actually still a bit of performance scaling at 1080p. The RX 6900 XT stock card did 185 FPS average, maintaining a 1.5% lead over the 6800 XT. That said, we're at a point where there may be additional headroom obfuscated by the nature of 1080p's reduced GPU workload. We'll be able to counter that with ultra settings in Total War shortly, and that's exactly why we run Total War on such abusively high settings. The RTX 3090 Fe, which allegedly exists for allegedly $700, runs at 182 FPS average. That means it achieves 98% of the performance of the 6900 XT stock card for $300, allegedly $300 less, or $2,000 more, depending on where you buy it. Let's highlight that 6900 XT OC result separately though. The result was a performance regression here, which is what we warned about earlier. The performance was scaling at higher resolutions, but here we encountered clock issues that would need to be rectified by either increasing the voltage or reducing the frequency range. The latter of these is much harder to work with in that it barely works at all in the software. As always, you won't really know how stable your overclock is until you try a variety of different games and settings, and it's likely that as new games come out, you may need to adjust those settings. Due to review timelines, we can't rerun every single test to see if it's stable in every single resolution of every single game, so we just mark it when it's not ideal, like here. It's easier to just point out the reality anyway, and it helps to illustrate what you're looking for in terms of performance regression with settings that seem like they're stable otherwise. We need to run the 3090 on this one at a later date. We skipped some benchmarks previously due to the review timing and the resolutions. Total War 3 Kingdoms should be an interesting one for scaling. In this game, we run high settings, so they're high enough that there's clean scaling across all three resolutions. It's needlessly high. If you wanted to just enjoy the game, you could do so at high or very high settings rather than ultra, but ultra is useful for GPU benchmarking and differentiation. At 4K Ultra, the 6900 XT runs 45 FPS average, outdoing the 6800 XT by about 6.6%. Improvement with an OC is about 5.3%, and it's a clean improvement too, no weird stability issues. So far, we're 3 for 4 in OC scaling without regression. The RTX 3090 Fe ran 54.3 FPS average here, which is actually a massive lead over the 6900 XT of 19.9%. The RTX 3080 Fe also holds a 3.5% lead over the 6900 XT here, showing that the 6900 XT seems unhappy with its combination of settings, game, and resolution. AMD has an advantage in frame time consistency here, but we wouldn't say that it necessarily justifies the extra cost of the 6900 XT over one of the lower tier cards. Just like we wouldn't say the bump to a 3090, an average FPS for this one, is justified over cards lower than its cost. At 1440p, the 6900 XT stock runs 94 FPS average, allowing the OC an improvement of 4.9%. The RX 6900 XT now manages to crawl ahead of the 3080 in average FPS, but primarily on a technicality. In theory, though, this gap should widen as the resolution lowers again. The 6900 XT outperforms the 6800 XT by 6.3%, but the 6800 XT OC passes the 6900 XT stock result. As for NVIDIA's RTX 3090, that plots at 107 FPS average, a 14% lead over the RX 6900 XT stock numbers. That's diminished from the 20% lead, as a reminder, at 4K, but it's still a lead. The frame time consistency scaling, the issues from previously, almost completely vanish here, now out of range of whatever issue was cropping up in 4K on the NVIDIA devices, and scaling gives favor overall to NVIDIA. That said, AMD is closing the gap. The 3080 FeOC proved to have worse consistency in 0.1% lows due to errant frame times that the stock results sometimes produced. But 24/7 use obviously demands more tuning for an OC anyway. This game will offer some of the most useful insight to scaling since the graphics settings are demanding enough to largely eliminate the CPU from the scenario. The 6900 XT stock at 1080p ran 147 FPS average, which positions the RTX 3090 Fe in a lead of 7.6%. As a reminder, at 4K it was 19.9%, then 14% at 1440p, and now again 7.6% at 1080p. Red Dead Redemption 2 is next, first at 4K. We've previously shown Vulkan results with AMD cards as well, which you can check in the 6800 and 6800 XT reviews. For this one, the RX 6900 XT stock card ran at 84 FPS average, which has it 11% ahead of the 6800 XT stock card's 75 FPS average result. That's a more meaningful gain than in some of the previous tests. The 6900 XT OC gained marginally here at 86 FPS average, but it remains overall not particularly worthwhile unless you just enjoy the process of overclocking. Compared to the RTX 3080 FE card, the 6900 XT runs about 1 to 2 FPS average below it, with 1% and 0.1% lows that aren't different in any noticeable ways. They're roughly the same here, in other words, with the 3080 technically leading in our tests and also being technically cheaper. The RTX 3090 sits at 92 FPS average, leading the 3080 by 8.5% and the 6900 XT by 10%. Now on to 1440p. Previously, the 6900 XT led the 6800 XT by 11%, but at 1440p that widens to 16%. The 6800 XT gets close to the 6900 XT, but not close enough to totally invalidate it. It's just enough to keep the 6800 XT's value better. The 6900 XT OC pushes to the top of the charts here at 148 FPS average. And as for comparisons to NVIDIA, the RTX 3080 sits between the 68 XT stock and the 69 XT stock, allowing the 69 XT a lead of 13.8%. The 3090 is 5.7% ahead of the 3080, and the 6900 XT is 7.7% ahead of the RTX 3090 FE, despite being behind in the 4K test previously. Finally and briefly, at 1080p, we're really only testing to understand the scaling behavior at this point of the benchmarks. These cards should more likely be accompanied with a higher resolution than 1080, but we can still learn from it. The 6900 XT stock card led the 3090 FE by 7.7% at 1440p and was behind at 4K. But it leads the 3090 FE by 14% in this one. The lead is widening as resolution decreases. That doesn't mean either is a particularly sensible purchase when compared to the 3080 and the 68 XT cards, but the flagship battle allows NVIDIA a chart topper at 4K and AMD a chart topper at 1080p and 1440p, although technically both companies are more positioning their 6800 XT and 3080 cards as the true gaming flagships. We'll skip the usual Vulkan to DX12 comparison, as we've shown several times now. AMD's stronger performance is in DX12 presently, so this was its best case scenario, and if you want to see the scaling where NVIDIA is typically a couple percent ahead, AMD is typically a couple percent behind in one API versus the other, you can check our 68 XT review. Next up is Rainbow Six Siege, which runs comically high frame rates on these $1,000 and $1,500 cards. Starting at 4K, the AMD RX 6900 XT stock card held 168 FPS average, with lows at 144 and 138. The RTX 3080 holds a lead of 6.4% over the 6900 XT at 4K, while the RTX 3090 FE holds a lead of 20.8%. Compared to the 6800 XT, the 6900 XT leads by 8.4%, and performance for the 6900 XT overall isn't strong here. It's fine, but it's hard to justify why you would buy it for this anyway. Same for the 3090. We had the overclock stability issues again in this one, so we dropped it from the charts due to time. That said, the OC clearly doesn't hugely influence the data here, judging from the 6800 XT's stock and OC entries, which we'll highlight as well. At 1440p, the RX 6900 XT leads the 6800 XT stock result of 323 FPS average by 9.9%, widening its gap from 8.4% at 4K. As for the RTX 3090, its lead narrows to 1.2% from 20.8% at 4K, a significant reduction from its previous heights. The RTX 3080 sits between the 6800 XT stock and OC results, giving us an anchor point for more reasonably priced cards. We'll start going through these a little bit faster. You can pause for more detail as always, but at 1080p, the 6900 XT becomes the chart leader at 453 FPS average, leading the RTX 3090 FE by a couple percent. The 6800 XT OC encroaches on the 6900 XT, but once again doesn't quite get there. Ray tracing performance is next. We currently have a limited set of 4 games for this that we chose prior to the launch of the RTX 30 series, but we'll refresh it in our next GPU methodology update in 2021. We do 2 of those per year, so it's not too far off. The games chosen include Shadow of the Tomb Raider with Ray Trace Shadows enabled, and this is where AMD stands the best chance versus NVIDIA. Then we have Control with hybrid rendering. We have DLSS on and off benchmarks for most of the RTX cards. We have Minecraft with full path tracing, and Quake, which doesn't work on AMD right now, so it's not in these tests. Tomb Raider is first. AMD has the best chance here because it's still mostly rasterized, just with some RT shadows, which are relatively lightweight compared to other features. This means that AMD can still leverage part of its rasterization advantages. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K with ray tracing, the RTX 3090 ran 65 FPS average, leading the RX 6900 XT by 25.4%. The RTX 3080 also leads it at 56 FPS average to 52, so it's not as much of a lead. The 6900 XT outdoes the 6800 XT by 7.5% in this benchmark. At 1440p, the RX 6900 XT maintains a 6.8% lead over the 6800 XT, but it's still beaten by the 3080 and it's heavily defeated by the RTX 3090. Finally, at 1080p, the 6900 XT is doing fine in a good enough sense, but remains poor value compared to the 3080. Minecraft is going to be about the worst representation of AMD, so keep that in mind. Also, the fact that Minecraft RT is still in beta will influence these results as the game ages. The 4K RT results show that it's unplayable without DLSS, where we have an RTX 3080 at 33 FPS without DLSS, or at about 87 FPS with DLSS. As for the 6900 XT, that's at about 15 FPS average, compared with 14 and 12 FPS for the other AMD RX cards. This one it's not going to work out since it's fully path traced, so AMD has nothing to gain from its rasterization pipeline advantages, and because it completely leverages RT hardware in this game, it's going to be behind there too. We don't have 3090 numbers with DLSS off here, and we won't due to the unique time circumstances and constraints that I have during this review cycle, but the good news is that they're irrelevant, because you shouldn't be buying a 3090 for gaming anyway. The 3080 is one that we do have, and even in a like-for-like scenario with DLSS off, it's still heavily advantaged by over 2x here versus the 6900 XT. At 1440p, the AMD RX 6900 XT ran at 32 FPS average, whereas the NVIDIA RTX 3080 held 130 FPS average with DLSS on and 68 with DLSS off. Again, that's more than 2x the performance of the AMD card in terms of frame rate, and even more with DLSS on. DLSS on is also a completely valid way to play this title, since the blocky nature of Minecraft makes it easy to predict and reduces the risk of any meaningful image quality loss that you might see in games that aren't the same blocks pasted over and over. Finally, at 1080p, the 6900 XT climbs to 52 FPS average, which is actually playable. That's pretty good for where it was positioned previously. That still marks the 2060 KO with DLSS on as better, or the 3080 without DLSS as 77% ahead. Last up is control. For this one, we test with both DLSS on and off for NVIDIA, and we use the only settings available for AMD, which would be DLSS off. For NVIDIA, because DLSS fakes the resolution, it's not a true like-for-like comparison to toggle RT on and off, but also toggle DLSS with it. So to get the full picture, ideally you do both of those things. You have numbers with DLSS on and off, and with RT on and off to get the full matrix for the testing. So that said, DLSS is a valid advantage in this title. DLSS 2 is actually decent here, and it doesn't make it look like they smeared Vaseline all over the screen like some other games look. As with Minecraft, we haven't fully added the 3090 numbers with DLSS off, but once again, that doesn't actually matter because you shouldn't buy the 3090 for this. We'll compare against what we do have for now. At 1080p, the 6900 XT ran 73 FPS average, which actually isn't bad. It's not competitive, but it's not bad and it is playable. The 3070 FE outdoes this one by 8.1% with DLSS off, and that's at 79 FPS average, or it has a 62% lead with DLSS on at 118 FPS average. Compared to the 6800 XT, the 6900 XT improves the numbers by 3.7%, so not that much. The 3080, meanwhile, ran at 106 FPS average with DLSS off, or 137 FPS average with DLSS on. And as a reminder, the 3090 numbers we only have with DLSS on, so we can't make the full comparison, and we'll just skip ahead. At 1440p, the RX 6900 XT stock GPU did 48 FPS average, with lows still paced proportionally behind and well overall. Unfortunately for the card, although it fares much better here than it did in Minecraft, it's not doing as well as it did in Shadow of the Tomb Raider competitively with the lighter RT workload. The 6900 XT is outmatched by the 3070 FE with DLSS off, running 51 FPS average. It's similar to the 3060 Ti with DLSS off, or the 2060 KO with DLSS on. At 4K, the 6900 XT card did 24.2 FPS average, hardly moving the needle versus the 23 FPS average of the 6800 XT. That puts the card as about 7.6% ahead of the RTX 3060 Ti, with DLSS off, mind you, or below the 3070 FE with DLSS disabled. The RTX 3070 ran at 47 FPS average with DLSS on, and it wasn't until the 3080 FE with DLSS on that we passed 60 FPS average. We'll quickly show power numbers as measured for total card power draw, not counting system draw. The RX 6900 XT stock card pulled about 300 watts in firm arc, tying it with the 6800 XT and placing it about 20 watts below the 3080 FE or 56 below the 3090 FE. The 6900 XT jumped to 350 watts when overclocked and undervolted. In 3 Kingdoms at 4K, the 6900 XT pulled about the same, 300 watts when stock, and again about 340 watts when overclocked, positioning it the same hierarchically as in firm arc. So that's it for the data. Now, similar to the 3060 Ti review, we're at a point where it's a bit disillusioning to review video cards and know that there's not going to be enough stock on launch day. The card is supposed to be launching at the same time as the review embargo lifts, from what we understand. So if that's the case and you've watched to this point, I'm sorry, it's probably out of stock by now. And that leads us down the 3060 Ti review path where we're saying, here's all the numbers, figure out how you feel about it. Now, ignoring the inventory completely and sticking to strictly MSRP and assuming availability, so this is where it's maybe more useful in a month from now, our opinion on the 6900 XT is similar to the 3090. You really shouldn't be buying it for gaming in almost any scenario. You'd be better off, if you want AMD, going with the 6800 XT. And if you're open to either, perhaps going with the 3080, depending on where the prices shake out for especially the partner models, which are the ones that are significantly better in quality of life features than the reference models from either company. So just like the 3090, the 6900 XT, it's a Halo product. It benefits significantly in that AMD, unlike NVIDIA, did not try to claim ridiculous things like being an 8K 60 FPS ready gaming card, which was clearly not actually true. It was true for maybe Doom Eternal, which, as we said before, can run on a Tamagotchi from the 90s. So they benefit there. The marketing wasn't as just false, but you still should buy one of the lower tier cars. So we would consider the 3080 and the 6800 XT to be the sort of true flagships for gaming. And those are the ones we'd push you to if you're trying to buy a flagship. If you have too much money, then sure, maybe a 6900 XT would get you, quote, just the best, especially in scenarios like 1080p, 1440p, and then NVIDIA starts to pull ahead, and especially in 4K, and NVIDIA is way ahead in the ray tracing tests that we do here. If you want high-end ray tracing performance and you have a good amount of money to spend on a GPU, you should be looking at NVIDIA. And if you want high rasterization performance, meaning you're not planning to run RT and you'd like to play especially in 1080p, 1440p, you're super competitive, maybe sponsored by a team or something, then the 6900 XT looks good. But otherwise, most people, you should look at the 6800 XT and the 3080. And for more discussion on that, check out the 6800 XT review. That'll have the most up-to-date information between the two. The 3080 review was before it came out. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll be trying to cover Cyberpunk 2077 this week, see how that goes. But that's the plan. And timing-wise, we're probably going to be publishing some older content like the second part of our Mac refurbishment series from the side of the road computer we got, and probably a couple of other things like old teardowns of 3080s that were odd. We have one of those that we haven't published yet. So that'll be coming up this week. Subscribe for that. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus, and we'll see you all next time.